It's a debate that's been on and off in Albany for nearly 4 years now, whether the state should implement a property tax cap, and if so, what should it look like? Governor-elect Andrew Cuomo campaigned on a 2% cap, and he's repeatedly said it's a cornerstone of his agenda. But some groups think that idea isn't in the best interest of New Yorkers. They formed a coalition they're calling the Omnibus Consortium, and one member of that group joins me in studio tonight. Ron Deutsch, the Executive Director of New Yorkers for Fiscal Fairness, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Well, first and foremost, we need to ask you about the name of this consortium here, the Omnibus Consortium. What are you trying to get across with that? It does.
It's all-encompassing, basically. Basically, the Omnibus Consortium is a group of property tax reform advocates, housing advocates, fiscal watchdogs like myself and the Fiscal Policy Institute. New York State United Teachers is involved. But it basically was formed by property tax reform groups that were coming together at the Swazi Property Tax Reform Commission hearings, and everybody was talking about the same thing. They were all talking about a circuit breaker as a mechanism to deliver property tax relief. And I was also talking about the same thing, and we all kind of got together and realized we had more in common than we thought, and we decided to work together to promote a circuit breaker as a responsible answer to the property tax problems facing New York State. And as that progressed, we were able to bring in other groups and other property tax reform groups from across New York State. But really, this is a group of citizen activists who have been working on this issue for a long time and were encouraged by the fact that the Swazi Commission was in fact created to address this problem, but weren't crazy about all the findings that the Swazi Commission had. And in fact, one of the things, if you look at the testimony during that Commission's hearings, you'll find that the vast majority of people were in support of a circuit breaker type of solution.
Well, let me walk you back a little bit here before we get too crazy with Omnibus. Just kind of explain to me the differences here. You're advocating for a circuit breaker. Governor-elect Andrew Cuomo is advocating for a cap.
Right. So let me be clear about the differences between the two, right? A circuit breaker ties your property taxes to your income. So that's to say, for instance, if you make less than $100,000 a year, you shouldn't be paying more than 6% of your income in property taxes. That would be under our plan. If you are, what would happen is you would get a 70% rebate for the difference between what you paid and what you should have paid under a circuit breaker. So it delivers substantial amounts of relief to people who are most overburdened, right? So then you have a cap. That's what Andrew Cuomo is pushing. A cap is a tax levy cap. So that's a levy on how much, a cap basically on how much a school district and or a county can levy through their taxes. So they're saying you can't increase taxes or your levy by more than 2%. Now, that would lead people to believe, though, naturally, that their taxes wouldn't go up by more than 2%, right? But nothing could be further from the truth. So a cap does not necessarily mean, just because there's a 2% levy cap, that the individual's taxes are not going to go up. And we've seen this across the board this year. You know, school districts really held the line on school tax increases this year. In my district, it was about a 1.5% increase, right? So, but then many people within the district saw their property taxes go up 5%, 10%. And why is that? Well, that's because there are multiple taxing jurisdictions within a school district. They all have different assessment processes that they go through. So they still have to raise the same amount of money. It's just a question of how you distribute the burden within that. So I think what we're saying is if you don't tie property taxes to income in a rational way, nobody's going to get relief.
Well, the circuit breaker has been brought up in the past without much success. How do you think you're going to get it through this time?
Well, the tax cap has been brought up in the past without much success either. So, you know, we don't have a tax cap and we don't have a circuit breaker. So I think the reality is, and Andrew Cuomo coming into this has said, you know, one of the biggest problems we're facing right now, people are paying unsustainable amounts in property taxes. You know, we know there are hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers right now that are paying 10, 20, 30, 40% of their income in property taxes. You have to address that. And a cap is not going to do that. If I can't afford my property taxes now and you cap them, I still can't afford my property taxes, and they're guaranteed to go up 2% a year. So the reality is a circuit breaker will tie your property tax burden to your income. And that's the most logical way to do this.
Well, New Yorkers have been screaming for some time now about something to be done. What's the roadblock that you're coming up against?
I think the roadblock with a circuit breaker is the circuit breaker costs money. I think the roadblock with a cap is the cap ties the hands of local school districts, of counties. And remember, basically what the governor wants to do is cap how much a district or a locality can raise through its taxes, but at the same time, he's basically saying, I'm going to be slashing state funding that's going to schools and going to municipalities. So it's really this kind of double whammy that he's setting counties and school districts up for, and it's really going to decimate services in New York. So, people are saying that, we have to get spending under control. Well, I think, just by basically shoving that burden to the local level and saying, you figure it out, that's Albany basically abdicating their responsibility. So if the governor is serious about wanting real reforms and changing the system, he needs to do that in Albany, not just say to localities, we're going to tie your hands and plus we're going to give you less.
Well, Governor-elect Cuomo ran on that platform that he wanted that 2% property tax cap, and it seemed to have got a lot of support. Some polls have come out showing there's a lot of support for it. You're saying it's not going to work?
I would say that the polls that have been conducted show support for it, but I don't think the general public understands the distinction and really understands what a property tax cap is. I think they think it is basically that you're going to limit how much my property taxes increase. And again, that's just not true, right? It's a levy cap. It's not an individual tax cap. And that's what Speaker Silver's been talking about. He's saying, yeah, I'm for a tax cap, but I'm for a tax cap, an individual tax cap tied to income, which is just another way of basically saying a circuit breaker, which is a way it probably makes more sense to people when you're explaining it. So, I think that, we have to look seriously. And we also have to understand that property taxes don't exist in a vacuum, right? We raise money from a variety of different sources in New York State. Generally, it's the income tax, it's the sales tax, and it's the property tax. So we have to strike the right balance. And right now, it's out of balance because there's too much pressure on the one tax, the property tax. And we would suggest that there's not enough pressure on the income tax. And what we've seen is over the last 20 or so years, we've seen New York's income tax structure basically become flat. We used to have some 15 brackets in our income tax structure. Now we've shrunk that to 5. And aside from the surcharge that we put in place, which expires next year, those 5 brackets, the top rate is paid by families making over $40,000 a year. So if you're making $40 million a year or $5,000 a year, you're still paying the top rate of 6.85% in New York. And while property taxes may be nationally above the national average, our income taxes are not. So I think what we need to do is reconfigure this tax relationship, put more pressure on the income tax, which is based on ability to pay. Plus, we also know that, as of 3:50 today, I believe the president is signing a tax cut bill or a tax bill that's going to basically allow the wealthiest Americans to keep those Bush-era tax cuts. And we would suggest that in New York State, what we have is we have some temporary income tax brackets. We have the top rate is paid now by families making more than $500,000 a year is now at 8.97%. We would suggest that since the feds have not acted, we maintain those current surcharges in place for another couple of years, right? Because obviously the state is still in a bind financially. We have a budget gap that needs to be addressed. And if we keep those surcharges in place, they're certainly going to help deal with that while we don't have to cut massive amounts of funding.
We have some pretty strong detractors in the Business Council who have said that your plan is... They don't love you. Well, I don't know if they don't love you. They maybe just don't love your ideas.
Maybe
they said it was a gimmick. They said it's not going to work. No way, no how.
Right, and we would strongly disagree with them and, have used the same language to describe the tax cap. So maybe we do have something in common. We both like calling things gimmicks. But, again, I would suggest that we are right and they are wrong. But, equity and fairness, I suppose, is in the eye of the beholder. But, if we think our biggest problem right now, and listening to people that pay property taxes, remember, school districts don't pay property taxes, counties don't pay property taxes, cities don't pay property taxes. It's individuals that pay property taxes. So we need to look at the burden on the individual and figure out a way to make sure that that person is not overburdened. And again, a circuit breaker is the only thing that does that. If you come in and cap, you're just capping an arcane system in place. You're basically capping the status quo. Now, you know, our detractors, the Empire Center, for instance, will say the same thing as the Business Council, that a circuit breaker shifts the tax burden, and maybe one group will pay less, but another group won't. Well, the group that won't, they aren't burdened by the property tax. They're not paying excessive amounts of their income in property taxes. So, you know, we would suggest that, you know, the top 1% in New York, quite honestly, over the last 30 years, have seen their share of the income skyrocket. I mean, we are now at a point where in New York City, the top 1% of New York City residents control 45% of the income in New York City. In New York State, the top 1% controls 35% of the income. Those are staggering numbers. You know, we're the #1 state in terms of income inequality in the United States. So it's really this tale of two New Yorks, not to invoke Elliot Spitzer's comments, but it really is a tale of two New Yorks. I mean, there's the New York of people who have made substantial gains over the last 20 years, while the other 90% of New Yorkers have basically been sliding backwards.
All right, you make some interesting points. I'm sure it'll be a good discussion coming up in 2011. Ron Deutsch, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.